necessarily lend. Wow, that's loud. Sorry about that. Turn that down a little bit. There we go. Or pull it down my tie there. It's also not a passage that necessarily lends itself to an invitation to respond, so to speak, though there might be in some ways. But it's the next section of our study through 1 Timothy chapter 5. And I think it is important for us to discuss for two reasons. One, because God decided to include the message of it in His Word, which means that it was important enough for God to tell it to us, so we need to take the time to study it. I thought about, as I was getting ready for this, passages like Psalm 119, 160, that say the sum of your word is truth. Or Acts 20, 27, where Paul says, I did not shrink back from declaring to you the whole counsel of God. And so if God decides to place something in His Word and put it before us, then it's appropriate for us to take the time to study it. The other reason I think it is actually an appropriate passage for us is because I have never been to a congregation that did not have people who were in the categories that are discussed in 1 Timothy 5, 1 through 16. And so it's relevant for our congregation. It's relevant for every congregation that I've had the chance to be a part of. And as you saw earlier on the first slide here, the title of the lesson is Regarding the Aged and Widows. I might could have found a better word than aged. I don't know. I tried to think of one, but it started making my brain hurt. So I decided to just put aged, and if I offend somebody, I'll just have to apologize to you later. But the first two verses, the ones Paul read for us, are where we're going to start our study this morning. And in fact, those two verses, they don't only speak to the older generation or about the aged. They actually speak to people of all ages, but we will make some specific applications to the aged here in just a moment. Now, when we read those first two verses that Paul read for us, just to reiterate them, it says, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. I think when you read these two verses, the overall message is pretty clear, and that is that we ought to address the people of the church and even, if necessary, correct our brothers and sisters in Christ, people in the church, with the same respect that you would give to the family whom you love. Now, he is basing this off the implication that you have proper relationships with your family, right? And so we're picturing a godly family here, right? The type of respect that you would show the father in the house, your brothers, your sisters, your mother. That type of respect, he says, is the same type of respect that you ought to show members of the church, the older men, the younger women, and the older women, if there ever becomes a point where they might need to be even corrected. Notice that he says in verse 1, this is the ESV, do not rebuke an older man. Now, what I don't think is that Paul means for Timothy to say that there is never a situation which an older man might have to be corrected. I don't think that's what he means by that. In fact, I'm sure he doesn't, because if you go to 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2, Paul, still writing to Timothy, will say to him, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. So there is an appropriate time, he says, to rebuke. That's what he tells Timothy. But there's a way to do it with patience and teaching. If you look at the New American Standard Bible in that first verse, what it will say is, do not sharply rebuke an older man. Paul, in his translation he was reading from, it says, don't angrily correct, or don't treat angrily or speak angrily to an older man. I think that's a better sense of what Paul is trying to communicate to Timothy. When you think about the relationships that you have in the household, it says that treat this older man or this older woman as you would a father and mother. And you know that there's a certain level of respect that you should give to your parents. I know when I was growing up, there was a certain way that I could not speak to my mother or father, and if I did, you know, it might end with, you know, a belt or a backhand, okay? And so you got to be careful about how you do it. But we should give them respect. And he says that's how it should be in the church, because after all, the church family is also your family. You notice he talks about younger women and younger men as well, to treat them as brothers and sisters. This is just general good advice, I think. Whenever you're having a conversation with or speaking to someone in the church, would you use the same type of language with them if you said it to your family member, or if you heard somebody else speaking to your family members the way that you are speaking? How would you feel about it? Would it upset you? Would you say that's disrespectful? And if so, maybe that's not the right way to approach the situation. And all in all, it comes down, it seems to me, to love and to respect. And so we can deal specifically, I think, with the aged, because it goes along with the topic of the next several verses, which is going to be widowhood. And so Paul read for us the first two verses of 1 Timothy chapter 5. What I want to do now is read with you verses 3 through 16. These verses will be what make up the next several points of the lesson. So we saw the first point, if you did not get it, was, let's see, there we go. The aged and all people should be treated with respect. That's the first point. The second point is going to be the responsibility of a widow's family. And so read with me, starting verse 3, a little bit longer section here. It says, "Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents. For this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has her hope set on God and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows. For when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows." All right. So, appreciate you bearing with me on that. Again, the second point of the lesson here, and we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about responsibilities to and about widows. And the first one here is the responsibility of a widow's family, of her family. Notice in verse 4, it says, "If a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God." So Paul tells Timothy it is the responsibility of the family. Specifically, he names children and grandchildren. There's a responsibility of the family to take care of or to support the widow that is in their family. And notice that he gives 3 reasons they ought to do this. The first one he says is they need to do it because it shows godliness. In other words, what's a godly way to behave toward a widow I might have in my family, whether it's a mother, grandmother, whatever it may be? And he says supporting them, that's a godly way to behave. And then he says not only that, but you should do it because it is owed to the widow. It says let them make some return to their parents. What does he mean by what does he mean by return? He says, let them get a return on their investment, so to speak. It is a return for what they have done for you. How many of us, can point to the things that our mothers and our grandmothers have done over the years to raise us, to support us, to help us when we were young. We would not be here without my mother and my grandmother. I can imagine when Paul is writing this to Timothy, that Timothy can relate to this idea of returning something back to his mother and grandmother. You remember the story of Timothy, how he got his faith? How did he learn the scriptures as a boy? He learned them from Eunice and Lois, his mother and his grandmother. And so Paul says here it should be a return back to them. It is owed, that widow. And also, and most importantly, I would say, because it is pleasing in the sight of God. This is a pleasing way in other words, this is how God desires for families to function. It's for the children and the grandchildren to take care of the widow in need in their family. I mean, we have all seen this happen where it's kind of the cycle of life in a sense. The mother, they take care of the child when they're a baby, and the child they have to have it. They can't feed themselves, they can't clothe themselves, and they rely upon their parents. But then the cycle of life happens, and sometimes the parents, they get older, and they rely upon their own children to take care of them and to have to provide for them. And that is, it's not really, in some cases I think we think that is a sad thing. It's not necessarily a sad thing. That is how God desires for a family to function, is for the children and grandchildren to accept that responsibility. When you get to verse 7, he says, "Command these things as well so that they may be without reproach." I think here he's talking about families, and he is, that term without reproach or blameless. That is a high compliment in Scripture to give someone, to say someone is blameless. In fact, if you go over to chapter 3 and verse 2, what you'll see is the first listed qualifications other than the desire for the office. The first listed qualification for an elder of the church is to be above reproach or blameless. So you come over to Paul's words to Timothy, says, what can a family do to be blameless, to be above reproach? Because one of those things is they can support the people in their family that need to be supported or taken care of. In verse 8 is probably more well known, I would say. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's pretty strong language, isn't it? He's denied the faith, worse than an unbeliever. I mean, unbeliever's pretty bad, right? I mean, being lost is bad. He says you're worse off than that. It's not just that you're an unbeliever, but your actions are pretty, they're pretty bad in the sight of God here. And so what this communicates is you can't really be a person of faith. Can't be a person who loves God with all his being and loves his neighbor as yourself if you don't love and respect your family enough to care and provide for them. I think a lot of times when we quote verse 8, and this is not to say this is a misapplication, I think it does apply in this instance, but we quote verse 8 of 1 Timothy 5 to make the point that the father and the parents in a family need to provide for their children, right? If you don't provide for those in your household, you're worse than an unbeliever. And that's how we apply that verse. And I'm not saying I think it does have application there. But the context is actually not about that. The context of 1 Timothy 5, that first part, is providing for older people in your family who can't take care of themselves anymore, specifically widows in your family who aren't able to do it. And I don't know that we always apply the verse like it was meant to in that context. Again, I think it can be applied both ways, but that was the context originally given in the letter. When you go to verse 16, the responsibility of the family is restated. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. You see the responsibility of the family is restated. And also it says, when a family does this, when a family takes on this responsibility, accepts the godly responsibility to care for the widow in their family, what it does is it relieves the church of a burden. And I don't think what it means by that is, it is a burden for the church to help people like, I guess we have to help this person. I don't think it's meant like, I think what it means is if the church tried to provide for every single person in the congregation, it would not have the resources to do so, right? It's just not realistic for that to happen. And just realistically, if the church answered every case of benevolence that came to it, the church would run out of resources pretty quickly. And so the church has a responsibility here to be wise in what it does. But it says to the family here, if you accept the responsibility of caring for those in your household, caring for your family, taking care of your widows, what it does is it actually enables the church to provide for and care for the people who really need it, and people who have no one else to do this for them. And says that you have that responsibility in your family so the church can help another person if they really need that help. We'll talk about this idea of what does it mean to be truly a widow. You see that, so that they may care for those who are truly widows, or widows indeed, some translations might say. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. One other thing I wanted to say here in verse 8. If we go back to verse 8. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Okay, we're talking about widows in 1 Timothy 5, and Paul speaks of them as being members of the household. You notice that? I think it was expected then, just implied, that if a woman was widowed and she had, say a son, she was going to remain in the household and live with her son's family. And that was a lot more common. In fact, multiple generations in the first century all lived in the same household, and so that they were just all there together. I'm not saying this is a necessity, but I would just say that it is very possible that in the sight of the Apostle Paul, it is just an implication that one of the better ways to provide for a widow in the family is for her to be a member of your household. I'm not saying that she has to necessarily live there. There can be multiple ways that you help take care of a widow. But that seems to be the implication of Paul here in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Now, let's talk about the responsibility of a widow's church family. All right, so the widow has a family. So she's got a family. The family has a responsibility to take care of her. Now let's talk about the church family. In verse 3, it says, honor widows who are truly widows. That verse really sums up the entirety of the church's responsibility to widows. And so in order to understand verse 3, you got to understand two definitions. The first one is, what in the world does Paul mean by truly widows? Because to me, to be a widow is to be a widow. You're either a widow or you're not, right? So what does he mean by that phrase? Well, I don't think he means that like certain circumstances change, like whether or not you really went through the loss that it takes to be a widow or something like that. Here's what it comes down to. There are some widows who are able to work and to provide for themselves because they're young enough, they have the health, they have the skills and the ability to do that. Even in the first century, there were women who were able to do that. Women like Lydia, for instance, that we read about, who seems to be single in the past. I don't know if she's widowed or not, but seems to be single, but has the ability to provide for herself, right? There's some widows who have that ability. There are also some widows who have children. They've lost their spouse, but they have grown children who are able to care and provide for them. There are also widows who decide and have the ability to remarry, which means that they have another spouse there to help care for and support them. It says that some widows fall into that category. But on the other hand, there are some widows who, at the time they become widowed, they're too old to get remarried again. They don't have the health or the ability anymore to take care of themselves. And there are some widows who they've not only lost their spouse, but maybe they didn't have children, or maybe their children tragically have been lost as well. In other words, this widow, they don't have anyone to care for and to support them except for the church family. The church is there to care for them. And I think that is what Paul means when he says widows indeed, truly widows. Not that a widow who has a family is not a widow, but in the sight of the church and who they're going to help, he's talking about a person who is truly a widow. In fact, if you go down and look in verse 5, it'll start off and say, she who is truly a widow left all alone. Well, it's kind of a sad phrase, right? But what it means is she doesn't have anyone except the church. And the church is to be there for her, to love her, and to care for her. Okay, so two definitions we needed. Truly widows, widows indeed. That's who we're talking about. What does it mean when it says honor? Well, does it just mean we need to respect? I mean, we saw in the first two verses we do need to respect older women. But that's not all that it means, right? If you go over to verse 17 of chapter 5, it'll say the same word. It'll say, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor. What does honor mean there? Well, it's talking about financial support in 1 Timothy 5:17. And that's the same way that it's being used in 1 Timothy 5:3. In other words, widows who are truly widows ought to be supported by the church when they don't have any other way to be supported. And that's why when we go over to verse 9, it'll say, let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband. What is it talking about when it says enroll this lady? Enroll this widow. Enroll in what? Well, let's go to Acts 6 for just a second. In Acts chapter 6, verse 1, we read, this is the early church. Now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. In other words, here's what's happening in the first church. They recognized early on, we have the responsibility to care for the widows in our midst, and so they actually had a daily distribution. They would provide, whether it was money or they were actually giving food, whatever it might be, they would provide for these widows who were truly widows, who needed this help. But there was a problem, of course, that the Hellenistic widows weren't being cared for like they ought to be cared for. But I bring this up simply to say when Paul talks to Timothy about enrolling a widow, what's he talking about? He's talking about something like this, some type of program or system in which the church would care for the widows in its midst, the ones who were truly widows, who really needed to be cared for. So I don't know if I'm sure they had some type of system worked out. You could handle it several different ways. He says that some of them do need to be enrolled. The church has a responsibility to some of these women to take on this burden for them. Verses 11 and 12, here's what we read. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their faith. What in the world is going on in these two verses? What's the difference between the older and the younger widows? What's Paul talking about? Well, what seems to have been happening was the first century church here, they have this system or program. They would enroll a widow who really needed their help. And a widow would be added to this enrollment under the assumption, and probably her word as well, probably her saying this, that she has no intention to remarry. All right, well, we're going to add this woman to the enrollment. We look at this, she's over this age, she's not going to remarry. And so that assumption is there. But Paul says with the younger widow, that's a lot less likely to happen. They're a lot more likely to remarry. In fact, when verse 12, when it says they abandoned their former faith, the New American Standard puts it like this. They set aside their previous pledge. Well, to me, what that says is that they had given their word on something. Likely they had given their word that I'm going to accept the support of the church because I'm not going to remarry and I have no one else. But then they rescind that word later on. Why is this brought up here? Well, Paul tells Timothy who needs to be enrolled and who does not need to be enrolled. And what it tells us is that the church has the responsibility to be wise and selective in who it supports. Not because one person is more liked or more loved than another, but the church has a responsibility to do this so that it can actually help the people who really need the help. All right? Lastly, let's talk about the responsibility of a Christian widow. We've talked about the family's responsibility to the widow, the church family's responsibility to the widow. What's the responsibility of a Christian widow? Well, we go to verse 5 and read verses 5 and 6 and find it. It says, she who is truly a widow, left all alone, has, first of all, the widow should have her hope set on God. The widow should be constant in prayer, continues in supplications and prayers day and night. The widow should not be self-indulgent, but she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. That self-indulgent, she should not give herself to worldly pleasure, or wanton pleasure, some translations will put. And then we go to verse 10, and we read this. And having a reputation for good works. A Christian widow should have a reputation for good works. And then what Paul does here is he gives some examples in verse 10 of the type of good works a Christian widow might have been known for. Things like she brought up children, probably children she raised in a godly way. She might have lost them over time, but they were raised well and in a godly way. She nurtured them physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. Another example, she has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted. Notice that all these are examples of being a good servant. This Christian widow, when she had the ability, she cared for others who were in need. And now she needs to be cared for in her time of need. And then the verse ends with another all-encompassing statement and says that this widow has devoted herself to every good work. And then we go down to verse 13. We find that the Christian widow should, first of all, not be an idler, not be a gossip, not be a busybody or someone who gets involved in the affairs of others. Should not be one who gives the adversary occasion for slander. That word adversary there, what's it talking about? There are some people who want to criticize the church. They want to look at Christians, they want to find things to point out and say, well, this person says they're Christian, but look at how they act. Paul basically says the Christian widow has not given any opportunity. In other words, she is above reproach. She should be blameless. People may look at her life and they see someone who is living as a Christian and not finding a way to criticize the faith of the church. In verse 15, someone who is not strayed after Satan, or in other words, has been faithful to God above all else. Here's what I find when I start reading all of these responsibilities of a Christian widow. It comes down to this. A lot of the responsibilities of a Christian widow are things that are applicable to every single Christian. So in other words, the responsibility of a Christian widow is simply to live and to walk faithfully as a Christian. Almost all those things listed apply to everyone who is a Christian. So it's not really different than any other member of the church. When you think about some of these things that have been talked about, being a servant to others, not giving reason for the enemy to slander the faith or the church or our Lord, not going after the ways of the world and the ways of Satan. Maybe it's the case this morning, whether you're a widow or a widower or any member of the church, it might be the case that you look at things like this, like presented in that list, and say, I don't know that I've been carrying out my duties, my responsibilities to the church and to the Lord the way that I would like to. If you feel that way, no matter who you are, it doesn't have to continue being that way. You have the opportunity at any time, you have the opportunity now to make some type of change